This exhibit came from originally, I was an intern here, and Katie, I had talked to her about something we talked about in one of my art history classes of daguerreotypes, which is an old type of photograph. She pulled out a couple of Anne and George Tabor, who are a couple who lived in Yarmouth in the mid to late 1800s. I was looking at them and they were really cool, and then Katie goes, I think we have Anne's wedding dress on property. And that was really cool. And then I was going through and I was looking at the stitching going, that's weird. And then looking at other alterations that have been made and going, that's weird. And so that just spiraled into this and trying to figure out why that alteration was made or why this alteration was made. So that was the origins of this entire exhibit. It's very hard to display entire dresses or just skirts. Hers isn't too big, which was one of the things that was weird. And then there's another full dress over in the other corner that is 1870s. So we have those, and then we have these two back here, which are not historical objects, nor are they accessioned, but a hoop skirt that can be tried on. And then for this, we have a pair of technically hook and eye, but tie-on pockets that are examples of what likely would have been worn under like a wedding dress or any standard skirt of the time period. So silhouettes and fashion in general tends to change pretty quickly. This is true now, especially true now with the internet and how fast things move, though it's admittedly gotten weird in modern eras because so many things coexist. And it's harder and harder to say, like, you know, even for like the 80s, there's like, this is what the 80s looked like, and it's harder to do that these days. But in, especially in the 1800s, there's a pretty well understood kind of progression of how silhouettes moved, and something we still see today. Things tend to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and then collapse. And a lot of these, you know, involved a lot of undergarments, but the undergarments change. Like this, you know, hoop skirts only were around for 30 or so years, I think, 30 or 40 years anyway. But they, you know, they got bigger and then they got a little smaller and then they turned into bustles. And then they kind of went away entirely for a while. So it's, you know, it's changed. The early 1800s started pretty slim and relatively natural for the given value of natural body type, because there's, you know, never any one. They were shorter. They were still in the stays actually at that point, which is a precursor to the corset. The corset tends to be a bit more formed, where like with curves, whereas stays are a lot more conical. You start broad and then get skinny, and then your hoops would go out. So it just kind of created this nice little hourglass shape without having to like be an hourglass, which is great. By the 1830s, things had gotten much bigger. That's where you get some of the really ridiculous sized sleeves. You get the big puff, you get the big skirt, you get very garish, in some cases, color schemes and patterns, a lot of silk. Not one of your best eras to replicate if you live in a hot area, because it doesn't breathe super well. Some of these do. Some of these actually are very, very good at temperature regulation, just maybe not silk. 40s, 50s, 60s, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You've got the big hoops. This style of hoop comes in with a vengeance, because through to the, I want to say 50s, it's actually mostly petticoats. So you've got like 8 layers of skirt, and then your skirt, which is heavy and unwieldy and not super comfortable. And then the hoop skirt comes in and you have air around your legs and it's light and you can get the nice fashionable volume without the chaos. And yes, there were issues with people catching fire, but that existed before then. You know, you're working in a kitchen with an open fire, you have a large skirt, that's a danger. You have any skirt, that's a danger. So while people tend to bring that up as like, oh, hoop skirts were bad, it got a little worse, but no worse than it would have if they kept going with petticoats. That was just the fashion was a problem. Around the 70s is when it starts to smush back down. You start to go in the mid to late 60s, hoops start to shift from being round to kind of flatter in the front and more conical in the back. And then that kind of leads naturally into the bustle, which doesn't really have much support in the front, but has all the structure in the back, which slowly becomes just like bum pads, which provide a little bit of extra boost without all the cage and the chaos. And then eventually you get down to the point where it's mostly just tarlatan, which is a stiffening fabric. And then you get to the 1910s into the 20s where it's pretty formless. And at that point, corsets start to phase out and you start to get more of the softer things that we have now, as opposed to the very structured garments of the early 1800s. Anne Tabor, the woman whose wedding dress originally started all of this, was married in the kind of early 1850s. So her wedding dress would have likely originally had larger bell sleeves and kind of would have stopped around the natural waist to allow for a wider skirt, because hoop skirts were starting to come in at the time. And so they were segueing out of petticoats into the much lighter, much wider style, because with petticoats you can only get so big. With these things, you can go about as big as you want and as big as is practical. So when looking at that, we noticed that the sleeves don't match that, and that was the first real red flag of, okay, something's up here, because that's not a fashion that really has existed yet, and it won't exist until the 1870s at the absolute earliest, but was fashionable in the 1890s into the early 1900s. So it was weird. And also there's some stitching that was a little wacky and didn't quite track. One thing that was kind of difficult is that sewing machines were really invented or started to enter common use in the 1850s. So just going, hey, this is machine stitched, didn't mean much, because she could have had access to a friend's sewing machine, or she may have had one of her own. Unlikely, because they were pretty expensive and kind of unwieldy, but it's not impossible. There also may have been a Yarmouth sewing machine of one woman had one and they all just kind of shared it. There's no way of knowing. And looking through the family genealogy that we already had, Anne Tabor's son, her daughter passed away when she was 23, I believe, unfortunately, but her son did survive and actually had a very long life. And he married his wife, Anne's daughter-in-law, in the 1890s, which makes sense for the sleeves. And that was the first kind of, oh, okay, because it was pretty common at the time for garments to be reworn, modified, passed on to somebody else, because fabric is expensive and fabric was expensive. And if you had a garment, you don't want to only wear it once, which is also the reason the dress is not white. White wedding dresses came into fashion kind of slowly, but the first widely recognized one was Queen Victoria, partially because it was lace, partially because of the whole virginity thing, also just because she could afford it. I mean, if anyone could, it's her. And then so rich women started to take that trend, because you're not really going to rewear your wedding dress, thing you see a lot now. Most women couldn't afford that. You want a dress that is going to be your wedding dress, but then it's going to be your best dress, pretty much as long as it fits you. This is the dress you wear to fancy events, to church if you need it. Like it becomes, you don't wear these just once. We don't know if Georgiana, who was married when she died, wore the wedding dress, and so she may have also altered it, which adds a little bit of extra chaos in there, but also the kind of would provide a flow of the 50s wedding dress into late 60s, 70s-ish wedding dress into 90s. So there may have been a little bit of flow there, because there is the purple is a little odd for the 90s. It doesn't quite jive. It doesn't 100% vibe with the 70s either, but it would have been more likely in that era. So that's a little wrinkle in everything, but we're pretty sure that Anne would have given the dress to Elizabeth, who then would have changed the sleeves, made them bigger, pulled them in down at the forearm to get the kind of leg of mutton sleeves hadn't really come in yet, but it was approaching that era. That was kind of early 1900s, because like shirtwaists had started to come in, so women were starting to wear blouses and skirts. Not as common in the 1890s, but it was starting to become a thing, because none of these fashions just appear. It's like when they hit their peak era, they've been around for a little while. So yeah, that's some of the like chaos of trying to figure out, why does this originally 1850s wedding dress not look like an 1850s wedding dress? Which actually does lead into the bodice that's beside it, which is a little bit later. It is 1860s, but the two eras were pretty close. They had a lot of things in common. They had the kind of bell sleeves. In this case, they do come in at the wrist. They could have been open. that's just kind of a personal preference thing. It has the shorter waistline, which would have gone into the hoop. Generally has a similar silhouette. It's simpler in the front. It's not too pulled in. It doesn't hug towards down. It just kind of comes and stops, and provides a good just reference for where, like, what this may have looked like originally. The other full garment that we have that's out, the blue and black 1870s dress, acts as kind of a stepping stone. First of all, that's roughly when Georgiana got married, so it may have been what she may have done to it, or would have been similar, but also provides kind of a nice reference for, okay, how did we get from Gone with the Wind to this, like, to a little more Mary Poppins-ish? Like, how did we make that bridge? Because all of these things, like, while even between decades can seem dramatic, they didn't happen overnight. They all evolved into one another. So the two supporting garments add a nice bit of just context for how these things happened. So until around the 1850s, all sewing was done by hand. It's just, that's where you get seamstresses and tailors, and until the late Italian Renaissance, most garments were made by tailors. Seamstresses didn't really exist as a field yet. Tailors did women's clothing, men's clothing. They just did pretty much everything. And then mantuas became a thing, which is a very specific type of garment. And mantua makers came in, and they were predominantly women. This was a much looser fitted garment out of Italy. That's all 1700s. But then, so until that point, until about the 1850s, you're doing everything by hand, which is time intensive, it's laborious, it can cause problems in your hands. You can get arthritis, you can get tendonitis, whatever, and it just takes forever. And there's still some things where a good solid backstitch by hand is your best option, even over a sewing machine. However, in about the 1850s, sewing machines started to really enter the public consciousness. They had already existed in some forms, and there were a couple of different forms. So the lock stitch, which is what most modern machines do, you're just basic stitch. You get the bottom and top, and it locks, and that's why it's called lock stitch. Some earlier machines don't quite do it that way, and they do more of just a basic, effectively a running stitch, which just is one thread going through, which is a little less secure, which is why the lock stitch became a thing. They were big, they were bulky. The earliest were often hand crank, and then later on, I want to say closer to the 70s, 1870s, you got treadle machines, which you have a pedal, and so you'd push, and they're pretty solid pedals too, so you have a decent space, get your whole foot on there and go, and that would power the needle, and so your hands are free. Because if you've ever sewn anything with a sewing machine, having both hands free is very helpful. It's not critical necessarily, but it makes the whole process a lot easier for a bunch of reasons. And so that just sped the whole process up for a lot of women. It actually made it a lot easier for women to make clothing at home because you could do it much faster. Part of that, the difficulty in getting them and the expense though, is that they weren't common until later on. So you might have, there's the one woman who has it, and all of her friends, if they need it, they could go to her home and use it. The treadle machine held for a very long time Singer as a company, which is if you say Singer, most people are going to think of sewing machines. That's the people who make them today. They came around in roughly the 1930s, 20s or 30s, I want to say. At that point, the treadle was starting to go out, and they were starting to get smaller and a little more compact. They also contributed to the concept of ready-to-wear clothing. That was not a thing before the sewing machine. It's a little more complicated than that, but at the scale that the sewing machine allowed, it just wasn't a thing. Especially when industrial sewing machines came in, you could have factories. That's because industrialization was really starting to kick in at that time. And so it allowed, shirts, dresses, pants, whatever you want. Until then, there were definitely mass manufactured garments, and that's a whole history to itself. You can look into, it was a horrible industry because it was the Victorian era and nothing was done well. But, some women made 16 shirts in a day. Like an insane clip. You're making like 2 shirts an hour. And these are just basic men's shirts. They're not complicated. They're squares and rectangles. But the amount of stitching that goes into a Victorian shirt, and you're doing that by hand, and you're doing it for like 4 cents an hour or something. Like it's nonsense. It's so impressive. And these women had so many health problems. And that's not even getting into the hat industry. The whole fashion industry in the Victorian era was just nonsense. But so the sewing machine comes in, and it takes that process and makes it mildly less horrible for the workers. You do still get things like the shirtwaist fire, and there are still issues because labor laws were coming in, but it did streamline the process considerably from sitting and hand stitching. And there are some people who can outstitch sewing machines. If you really know what you're doing, they can at least keep pace with a modern sewing machine with especially with a running stitch. Running stitch is really fast, but for the most part, it takes the whole process and just squishes it on down and makes it a lot easier. So these things were kind of revolutionary in the fashion industry when they came out.
The Yarmouth History Center is located at 118 East Elm Street in Yarmouth, Maine. We are open 10 to 4, Tuesday through Friday, and it is free of charge to all visitors.